Please open your Bibles or read along on the screen with me. We'll be reading from Nehemiah chapter 4, 1 through 14. Now, when Sanballat heard that we were building the wall, he was angry and greatly enraged, and he jeered at the Jews. And he said in the presence of his brothers and of the army of Samaria, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish up in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish and burned ones at that?" Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, "Yes, what are they building? What they are building, if a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall. Hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn back their taunt on their own heads and give them up to be plundered in a land where they are captives. Do not cover their guilt, and let not their sin be blotted out from your sight, for they have provoked you to anger in the presence of the builders." So we built the wall, and all the wall was joined together to half its height. The people had a mind to work. But when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward and that the breaches were beginning to be closed, they were very angry. And they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. And we prayed to our God and set a guard as a protection against them day and night. In Judah it was said, "The strength of those who bear the burdens is falling. There is too much rubble. By ourselves we will not be able to rebuild the wall." And our enemies said, "They will not know or see till we come among them and kill them and stop the work." At that time, the Jews who lived near them came from all directions and said to us 10 times, "You must return to us." So in the lowest parts of the space between the wall, in open places, I stationed the people by their clans, with their swords, their spears, and their bows. And I looked and arose and said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, "Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes." So as we come to Nehemiah chapter 4, everything seems to be going wrong all at once. In chapter 1, we looked at how Nehemiah prayed, and just 3 chapters later, in chapter 4, things start to get more complicated for Nehemiah. Did you know that there is a plague sweeping the country today and the entire world? Yes, COVID-19, but there is also another problem that is very widespread. It's called discouragement. At least 3 things make it such a big problem. 1, it's universal. None of us are immune to discouragement. Everyone you have ever known has been discouraged at one time or another. 2, it's recurring. Being discouraged once does not give you an immunity to the disease. You can be discouraged over and over again. In fact, you can be even discouraged by the fact that you are discouraged a lot. And number 3, it's highly contagious. Discouragement spreads by even casual contact. People can become disheartened because you are discouraged. You can be bummed out because other people are discouraged. So this morning, we're going to focus on both the causes and cures for discouragement. Let's begin by looking at the causes. There are 2 main types of discouragement. One set of problems comes at us from the outside, and the other set attacks us on the inside. So let's look first at the external causes. The wall workers were initially excited. They began the work with great anticipation and joy. It says in verse 6 that the people had a mind to work. Things were going well, and the people were excited, and the wall was going up. Then something happened. Getting the work started on the wall was a major achievement, but keeping the workers working was a much tougher assignment. Where God is at work, the enemy is also at work. Rebuilding the wall of Jerusalem was certainly no exception to this. When people take kingdom priority seriously, Satan stirs up agitators to block the work of God. These enemies used two types of external forces. The first one was ridicule. We see this in verse 1. Now, when Sanballat heard that we were building the wall, he was angry and greatly enraged, and he jeered at the Jews. Sanballat was Nehemiah's greatest opposition. He is mentioned 3 times in the book, and every time he is seen standing against the work of God, rejecting and ridiculing everything that Nehemiah is trying to accomplish. The enemy often insults the servants of God. Goliath ridiculed David when the shepherd boy met the giant with only a sling in his hand, and the soldiers mocked Jesus during his trial, and the crowd taunted him while he was hanging on the cross. Sanballat and his team had begun to ridicule the workers even before the work had started. You can see this in chapter 2, verse 19. They jeered at us and despised us. Here in chapter 4, he is making a speech before the army of Samaria, intensifying the power of ridicule. Notice that he called the workers feeble. The word feeble means withered and miserable. Next, he ridiculed the job they were doing by asking 4 taunting questions. Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish up in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish? And in the world's eyes, they're not entirely false. How could a few feeble Jews build a wall strong enough to protect the city from mighty armies from all sides? Honestly, it would take more than a prayer and worship to rebuild the city, technically speaking. Building a wall, building a city back up, was a difficult task that could take several years and maybe even never finish. And with their building materials being so old and damaged, they couldn't possibly be used to make a strong wall. So these 4 questions are actually pretty valid in the world's eyes. But God's work always defies the odds and exceeds everyone's expectations and the limitations of reality. Whenever you attempt to get involved in the work of God, you will always face ridicule. Expect it, but don't stop working, because that's what the enemy wants you to do. But remember, God always triumphs. The second cause of their external discouragement was repression in verses 7 through 8. The enemies have moved from being bothered by the Jews to being very angry. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. Warren Wiersbe wrote, God's people sometimes have difficulty working together, but the people of the world have no problem uniting in opposition to the work of the Lord. Ooh, how true is that? The references in verse 7 are to the 4 points of the compass. Sanballat and the Samaritans on the north, Ashdod on the west, Tobiah and the Ammonites to the east, and Geshem and the Arabs to the south. The workers were literally surrounded and lived in constant fear of being ambushed. Pressures from the outside often create problems on the inside. It wasn't the voice of the enemy that was the most pervasive. It was the voice of God's own people. And just like today, it's so easy to internalize the words of the enemy and feel like giving up. Notice the first part of verse 10. In Judah it was said. Discouragement started first within the royal tribe of Judah. They had David's blood in their veins, and you would think they would have had more faith and courage than the rest of the people. They were looked upon as leaders and pace setters. If the tribe of Judah was discouraged, then the other tribes would be more inclined to give up the project as well. The first cause of internal discouragement was actually fatigue. Verse 10 reads, "In Judah it was said, 'The strength of those who bear the burdens is failing.'" To put this into simple terms, it just means the workers were tired. They literally were failing. Their strength was failing. They were working hard and needed some well-deserved rest. When you are physically drained, it is very easy to become discouraged at the slightest problem. It's also interesting to notice when the workers became fatigued and discouraged. Verse 6 says that the wall was built to half its height. Many times when we start a new project, the first half goes quickly because we're excited about accomplishing the goal. But once we reach that halfway point, when the newness wears off and the work becomes routine and boring and the end just seems so far away, then it's easy to become fatigued. And when you're tired, it's easy to become discouraged and to begin to think that you will never finish the job. Verse 10 says, "We will not be able to rebuild the wall." They were literally ready to give up. These are the same people who were described in verse 6 as those who had a mind to work. If you're feeling fatigued today, watch out, because tiredness can lead to discouragement. Remember what God did when Elijah was tired. He sent an angel to give him some bread and something to drink, and then he told him to go back to sleep. You can't burn a candle at both ends on a long-term basis. Sometimes the most spiritual thing to do is to go to bed and to get some rest in order to avoid discouragement and burnout. The second thing that can happen is that you get frustrated. Verse 10 continues by saying that there is so much rubble that they cannot rebuild the wall. They became discouraged because they were just so aggravated with the situation they were in. Old broken rocks, dirt, debris, junk was everywhere, and it was frustrating to them, and rightfully so. Just as they lost sight of their goal, we can also lose sight of our goal when we have too much garbage in our lives. I don't know what the garbage is in your life, but whatever that may be, throw it away so you don't get tripped up. Now we know some of the causes of discouragement. Ridicule and repression can lead to fatigue and frustration. Let me tell you definitively that discouragement is a curable disease. This is good news. You don't have to live with a chronic condition anymore. Let's look briefly at the 3 cures for discouragement. The first and most obvious cure is to request God's help. Take a look at Nehemiah's first prayer in verse 4 through 5. "Hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn back their taunt on their own heads and give them up to be plundered in a land where they are captives. Do not cover their guilt, and let not their sin be blotted out from your sight, for they have provoked you to anger in the presence of the builders." Nehemiah wasn't praying for his enemies to become believers, but instead for God to judge them. He asks God to deal with them. Here's a lesson that we can learn from Nehemiah. When people talk against you, don't talk back, just talk to God. Take it to God. Verse 9 tells us that they prayed to God and posted a guard. When their enemies started talking, Nehemiah continued to pray, and the people continued to work. The second cure is to reorganize your priorities. In verse 13, Nehemiah says, "So in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, In open places, I stationed the people by their clans with their swords, their spears, and their bows. If the enemy were going to attack, they would most likely do so at the weakest places. So Nehemiah put guards at all the vulnerable spots. This served two purposes. It discouraged the enemy and it encouraged the people because it dealt with their fear. When we're discouraged, one of the things we can do is to reorganize our priorities. You can look at your life. You can adopt a change in approach instead of becoming so discouraged that you quit. Don't be overcome by discouragement. Do something about it. And last but not least, if you want to defeat discouragement, the third thing you can do is to remember who God is. After looking everything over and sensing the discouragement within his team, Nehemiah rallied his troops in verse 14. Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome. Nehemiah knew, even in the face of opposition, that the success of the wall was wholly dependent upon God who inspired its beginning. Verse 10 was true. The people could not rebuild the wall on their own. They needed to remember God and what he had promised. Now, I don't know about you, but it's easy for me to forget God when things are tough. I need to be reminded that he is always there for me. And how do you remember the Lord? By remembering that he will always be there for you. We are to remember that he is great and awesome, just like Nehemiah reminded the Israelites. God is more than able to deal with your discouragement. He is more than able to deal with your garbage. He is more than able to deal with anything in your life. So remember his greatness and his awesomeness. And never forget that he is always there for you. So when you're down, turn your attention from your discouragement to the one who is able to do something about it. God has been faithful to you in the past. He is faithful to you today, and he has promised to be faithful to you in the future. Remember the Lord, remember his promises, remember his goodness, remember his power. Our God is great and awesome, so remember him. The people complained about all the rubble in verse 10. Question: wasn't the rubble there in the beginning? Of course it was. The difference was that when they started the project, they were focused on God and his character. Now they had just become rubble gazers. If you focus on all the junk in your life and in the lives of others, you will become discouraged. So let's not be rubble gazers, but God gazers instead. So don't focus on the junk and the garbage and the rubble and the debris in your life, but instead focus on God and go to him in all your troubles. All right? Let us pray.